Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program, Gustave Baumann'S Book of Saints, a conversation with Tom Leech and Carmella Padilla. My name is Mark White. I'm the Executive Director of the New Mexico Museum of Art, and I'm so glad that everybody could join us tonight for this fantastic program. Our two guests tonight need no introduction. Nevertheless, I'm going to give them one anyway. Tom Leech is the director of the press at the Palace of the Governors and has more than 45 years experience in printing, papermaking, and related book arts. A curator at the New Mexico History Museum since 2001, Tom has organized several successful exhibits, including the St. John's Bible, Jack Kerouac and the Writer's Life, Out of the Box, The Art of the Cigar, and Album Amicorum, which also traveled to Spain, Germany, Switzerland, and Turkey. He is a co-author of the book Gustave Baumann and Friends, Artist Cards from Holidays Past, and he contributed an essay to the 2019 Gustave Baumann Catalog Raisonné. Books that Tom has printed include Jack Thorpe's Song of the Cowboys, sorry, my misstep there, O'Keeffe's Stories, Dr. Franklin in Spain, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and Gustave Baumann's Indian Pottery, Old and New. The Palace Press's most recent book, Gustave Baumann'S Book of Saints, will be released in December, and it will be his last before he retires at the end of this year. Tom is the 2013 recipient of the Santa Fe Mayor's Award for Excellence in the Arts, the 2014 Carl Herzog Award for Excellence in Book Design, and the 2015 Edgar Lee Hewitt Award from the New Mexico Association of Museums. He holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in painting and sculpture from Aquinas College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. A collection of his marbled and handmade papers was recently acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So welcome, Tom Leech. And our other distinguished guest for this evening is Carmella Padilla. Carmella Padilla is a journalist, author, and editor who explores intersections in art, culture, and history. She has published extensively in newspapers and magazines, including the Wall Street Journal, American Craft, and El Palacio, and has written several books, including The Work of Art, Folk Artists in the 21st Century, El Rancho de las Golondrinas, Living History in New Mexico's La Cienega Valley, Low and Slow, Low Riding in New Mexico, and The Chili Chronicles, Tales of a New Mexico Harvest. Padilla's 2015 book, A Red Like No Other, How Cochineal Colored the World, co-edited with Dr. Barbara Anderson in conjunction with an exhibition they co-curated at the Museum of International Folk Art, won the College Art Association's 2017 Alfred H. Barr Jr. Award for Distinguished Scholarship in Art History. In 2017, Padilla edited Borderless, The Art of Luis Tapia, exploring the art and life of a pioneering New Mexican Chicano sculptor. Her previous work with the New Mexico Museum of Art includes guest curating the 2002 exhibition, Eliseo Rodriguez, El Sexto Pintor, featuring the paintings of a prominent 20th century New Mexico Hispano artist and participant in the early Santa Fe art colony. A native Santa Fean, Padilla is the recipient of the New Mexico Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts and the Santa Fe Mayor's Award for Excellence in Literary Arts. She is currently at work on a book highlighting the historic markers and movements in 20th century New Mexican furniture. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Jonna Gottschalk, our assistant curator at the New Mexico Museum of Art and curator of the exhibition Go West, Set a Small Voice, Gustave Baumann and Dreams of New Mexico. If you've not had a chance to see the exhibit, I highly encourage you to do so. It's fantastic. So without further ado, I will introduce Jonna, Carmella, and Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
I'll just there's Tom. There's Tom. All right, I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint that we can start off with. First of all, thank you both so much for agreeing to do this. I'm giant fans of both of you, and I'm really honored to have you here today to talk about this. It was during COVID that I started working at the New Mexico Museum of Art, and I curated this exhibit under a little bit of pressure of not being able to get into the museum and see the artwork. So I had to draw from a lot of places, and unfortunately I did not tap into Tom and Carmella as quickly as I should have, but I did hear of this project they were working on. The exhibit, kind of came at this exhibit in a way where I was looking at this suite of Santos that Baumann had made. And my background has primarily been looking at New Mexican art. So, northern New Mexico art. So I kind of was drawn to these, and that was really the jumping off point. So when I heard about this project, I was really excited to bring them in. So I am going to have you all describe this project. Tom, I know that this started out as a donation of a collection to the History Museum, and I will let you continue from there, and please let me know if you want me to change the slide at any point.
Well, okay. Thank you, Jana and Mark, for inviting us to do this presentation. And thank you also for mounting the new exhibit. You and your team have done a really fine job of giving the public a chance to see some unusual works by Baumann. And also thanks for the chance to talk about our new book. You're asking about the book project and how it's got started. So I'd like to back up a bit. Included in your exhibit are prints from the suite of New Mexico Santos by Baumann. What we're looking at on the screen right now is the title page of that. It was printed in Santa Fe by Linnea Gentry in 1983. It includes 8 different Santos images. Why don't you go to the next slide there?
I'm just going to restart this. It looks a little bit funny.
There you go. Great. So these might be surprising to a lot of people who are otherwise familiar with Baumann's colorful work and his landscapes and so on. And honestly, I was surprised the first time I saw these. I could never figure out how they fit into the rest of Baumann's collection, his lifetime collection of work. Why did he do these images? But in 2015, we did take in a collection. It came from Linnea Gentry, who was a noted printer some time back. And the collection had 34 sets of blocks by Baumann bearing the image of Santos, along with his drawings and prototypes for a book, plus an unpublished Mary Austin essay that was written to accompany the prints. The whole ensemble offered both questions and mysteries, but it also presented itself to me as a printer as a shovel-ready project for the Palace Press. Let's see what the next slide is. Yeah, so what came to us from the collection was these drawings that Baumann did that were just so intriguing. And they obviously related not only to that 1983 portfolio, but they were preparatory sketches for this book project he had in mind. And that just prompted a whole chain of thoughts about, what can we do about this? What opportunities does this offer us? So in thinking about how we could put a book together, I did run into Carmella and we did some brainstorming. And we were also very interested in trying to find out some of, where were the original pieces? And so in this case, what we see is Our Lady of Immaculate Conception. That's the English version. I don't have Spanish, but you can see how Baumann was tracing these following the progress of these Santos as they were leaving. Carmella, do you want to just talk about what Baumann was responding to when at that particular time?
Sure. Thank you, Jonna and Mark and Tom for having me here tonight. And thank you especially to Tom for making me part of this project. This was also a surprising project to me. I'd written about Baumann in the past, but had never really explored his work with Santos and actually knew very little about it. And as it turned out, I was always thinking about Baumann in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And this was one of his earliest projects, that was launched really in the early 20s in terms of his exploration of the New Mexican landscape when he first arrived here. And in this case, he and Mary Austin decided to get together and talk about this book to talk about the Santos in book form. This was in the, it was really an encounter they had on the Santa Fe Plaza probably in the early 30s. One of the things that was challenging about this project is nothing was really accurately, exactly dated. But they got together, and he had already been doing this examination of Santos from the early 20s. And what Tom and I concluded really was that he was starting to get worried that as these Santos were beginning to be discovered, if you will, and ultimately commercialized, that they were leaving their traditional villages and traditional heritage settings, and they were being sold, they were being placed in museums. And we feel like it was his goal to start to document some of the works that he was seeing before they left the state. He started, actually, I should back up a little bit, working with Peggy Pond Church, who at that time was an early native New Mexican, but very unknown poet. She would become very well known for the house at Ottawee Bridge in the 60s, and also eventually very well known as a poet through time. But at this time that he ran into Peggy in the mid-20s, and he asked her to start working on a suite of poetry related to this book. And so they both really embarked on this project in 1927. So it really was pre-Mary Austin as well, even though that was the main essay, I believe, that came with the collection, if that's correct, Tom.
Yeah, that's right. So in 1929, Baumann already had a book proposal, and he was in New York, and he talked to Elmer Adler, who was a very influential printer and publisher of that period. And Adler loved the book, but really didn't have a way to market it. So he proposed it to Alfred A. Knopf over dinner, and also to Random House. And both publishers said, it's a great idea, but we'll just never be able to sell this. So he probably came back to New Mexico and sat on it for a while. And maybe that's about the time he ran into Mary Austin, and that kickstarted it again. And then Mary Austin died in 1934. Well, within just a few months, Baumann was he was in San Francisco and talking to Edwin Grabhorn, who's still regarded as one of the great American printers. And there is sort of a memorandum of understanding between Grabhorn and Baumann that the Grabhorn Press would print the book. But that didn't happen, and we really don't know why that didn't happen, but you can guess, and there are a number of reasons that I think of would be outstanding. One, it's the Depression, and so people were looking at money and where to get it and how to make it, and it just was not presenting itself as a real commercial success. Also at the time, there were other people starting to work on Santos and doing some scholarly research, and there were other books being published, and it just seemed like Baumann just stepped aside to let everybody else do this. But as late as the 1950s, he was still talking about doing this book. Oh, can you go on to the next
Sorry,
slide?
yeah, I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself for a second. I just had a quick follow-up there. You kind of touched on Baumann's relationships to the Santos, and I know Mary's was very different, and I know they both kind of came at it with like a secular approach, but you know, in reading your essay, I got the sense that their reasonings behind doing this project were just completely different. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about where she was coming from there.
Well, and this particular slide is relevant in the sense of this image of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception was a piece that was collected on an early journey that Mary Austin and Baumann took together, along with Mabel Dodge Lujan and Tony Lujan, in probably around 1922. And they went on this kind of outrageous and, I guess I would say, courageous buggy ride across through northern New Mexico, horse-drawn buggy ride for 10 days. And they went to all these different villages throughout northern New Mexico and visited the Santuario de Chimayo. They visited people's homes, and they actually were they collected. And Baumann was not collecting. He really was clearly an observer on this journey. And we know about this because there's a wonderful recording and a transcript in the collection of the History Library, where Baumann is recalling this seminal trip where they first had their shared experience of Santos together. And he is talking about observing the communities and really taking it in and watching Mary and also Mabel collecting things, buying things. And I think that really sort of also hit home with him as to even within his own life, how he and the newcomers, because they had just arrived about 3 years earlier, both he and Austin arrived in New Mexico in 1918, how the landscape was changing because of their practices and their exploration, no matter whether it was respectful or not respectful, but they did have a different approach. And this particular piece, which is now in the Taylor Museum, was collected on that trip. So it's no surprise that it's one of the pieces that he actually documented in various ways. And she talked about it as well. But it's a pretty important piece in the story.
Next slide. Right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the mysteries that have been revealed by taking in this collection, some of the answers. It was always known that in the Linnea Gentry suite, that Baumann didn't complete the blocks. He had carved all of the Santos images and 3 of the background images, but there were still 5 undone. And so Linnea Gentry asked Willard Clark, another noted Santa Fe printer, if he would carve the background blocks. We just never knew which ones they were. So what we do know now are, and because of being able to examine the blocks, Baumann carved the backgrounds for San Francisco and San Ildefonso and Rosario. And the other blocks, when we can tell, because Willard Clark would coat the blocks with a white substance. I don't know if it was a gesso or a white paint before we would carve it. So some of the blocks, so on the left, where we have Our Lady of Immaculate Conception, you can see the background block is sort of has this white on it, whereas the San Francisco doesn't have that. So it's really great to be able to finally identify which ones were Willard's and which ones were Baumann's. Let's go to the next slide. yeah, again, you can see we're comparing the original, or well, let's start with the drawing in the center. Linnea Gentry's print is on the left, and the one that we're including in our book is in the right. I should point out that Baumann, throughout this period working on the Santos, he would go in and carve these same images sometimes 3 or 4 times in different sizes. So I'm just going to call it the Gentry portfolio. The images are larger than the original ones that we're including in our book. What's next? Carmella, why don't you talk about this?
So in doing the research on the project, we actually looked at the 34 woodblocks and prints and tried to start out by comparing them to pieces that we might be able to locate, whether they be in private collections or in museum collections. We weren't always successful in finding where these pieces are today, because many of them really have been lost to time. In a few lucky instances, like with the previous image of the Immaculate Conception, and this one in particular, also in the Taylor Museum collection, we actually found the originals and looked at how Baumann was representing them in his woodblocks. And it's very interesting. He takes an approach in some ways where he's taking, I feel, a little bit more loose creative license. And in others, he is actually doing exact replications. In this case, this is a School of Rafael Aragon, I believe, San Fernandez, and it's attributed to Rafael Aragon, an image of San Fernandez. And he copied it to a T, as you can see. I mean, even to the point where he inaccurately placed an accent on the E in Fernandez, where there should not be an accent at all. But he was looking at the original, and if you see the original retablo, as you do here on the left, you see that he really was doing a very close replication. And in other cases, he didn't do that. But this is one case where we were able to attach an actual piece to a piece that he had done a woodcut of. The previous piece also of the San Francisco de Asís, the hide painting, is a piece that we know it's in the Museum of International Folk Art collection.
And I tried to find an image of that and I couldn't online, but we'll keep working on it. You know, I'd also like to point out that the original attribution and the naming of these santos is in many cases totally inaccurate. And that's one of the things that we found to be pretty interesting, because at that time, they really didn't know. They were gathering this information for the first time. So what we have tried to do is at least give the most up-to-date name for these different santos. Yeah. So I wanted to show some of the components that came in with our collection. I think there were 4 different prototypes done, let's say from 1929 up to probably 1940 that Baumann worked on. At one point, the book was to be titled The Little Saints of New Mexico, and you can see his sort of calligraphic rendering of letters in pencil, which then he inked on this one up in the upper left, drawing in the center of the Santa Familia, and how it turned out in one of his proof books there in the upper right. The image in the lower right is a Job from one of the prototype books. And what I found interesting about that, the text that's pasted in was clipped from pages from his 1939 book, Frijoles Canyon Pictograph. So that just proves that he was still working on the book as late as 1940. But there on the left is the first page of the Mary Austin typescript, which we were just so flabbergasted to find. And Carmella would have a lot to say about that, I think.
Well, Baumann suggested it was probably her last manuscript. If we don't know that exactly, but it was one of the very last manuscripts that she was doing. It was a little scattered, a little bit all over the place, which at the time that they met, they actually met on the plaza and they decided to collaborate on this project. She was very sick, she was dying. And so the piece feels a little bit random in some ways and a little bit hurried, as certainly of its time. So that said, it can be ill-informed a little bit. It can be sometimes patronizing, but you can see that the scholarship and this field of scholarship that she helped, she had such a huge hand in conceiving. It was in progress. And that's what's so great about this whole project and the way that Tom's talking about, these different renderings through time, and we're talking about all these conversations and attempts to get published through time, and even the misidentification of the Santos. The story for me was really about the social commentary of what was going on in New Mexico, and particularly in northern New Mexico around Santos at the time. And so nothing is set in stone. Everything is still being discovered, and everything is still a work in progress. Is this saint, like the Immaculate Conception saint, she was originally known as Our Lady of Innocence, as she was known in the village of Abiquiu. And then, Santa Rosa de Lima, but they also called her Our Lady of Innocence. So there were various names attributed to her, as well as to these other pieces throughout the book. So Austin's essay really illuminates that work in progress. She's guessing at things. She is actually saying things that today we know are inaccurate, or what she is writing is suggesting that there's still a lot of research to be done. And if you think about it, she died in 1934. That research is still being done today. So it's so important to have this kind of material, even though the conversations have come so far since then, and the knowledge has come so far. This really is grounding it in a foundation of a field of scholarship in New Mexico that Austin and Baumann and Peggy Pond Church all had a hand in.
And I'd also like to point out that I showed this essay to a number of other scholars, and everybody was sort of shaking their head going, oh, you just can't publish this. So I really have to commend and thank Carmella for taking this on, for tackling it, and really putting it in context. It's a great contribution to the field.
Thank you. I mean, for me, it was, I guess, I never come to anything from the art historical perspective first. I come to the story first. And the story was there ready to be written about what was happening in this community. And the privilege for me and actually in some ways the ease of this research, even though it wasn't easy, was just that there was so much that these people wrote and contributed that they were telling their own stories. And so it made it a much easier puzzle to put together, because they had left these threads of documentation and history through time.
What's next, Jonna? Oh, okay. So this is sort of a work in process. This whole project gave me a look at how Baumann thought and worked. His original drawing of Our Lady of Guadalupe on the left. In the center is you can see him thinking about this book. He's saying, how do I put a background into this? So he printed a solid brown tan-colored background, and then proofed his block. And then here he's cutting out the block or the image from a piece of paper. So that's actually just pasted onto the printed background. And so this one of the prototypes, it's all rendered this way. So then the next on the right is one with his new background carved, and those were his colors, and those were the colors that we chose to do our book in. So then we just wanted to get the job on the press, and I just have to tell you how exciting it is to sort of have a book project in mind for a long time and finally seeing it come to life, getting it on the press, seeing printed pages and so on. So here you see a Christo image on the left and Job on the right. Of course, when they're printed, they come out reversed. But then you can see two other or another spread, San Miguel and Santa Familia, but you can see just the background blocks printed. So we had to print the background blocks first to sort of get them in the proper position on the page. And then the Santos were overprinted that. And, you know, I have to say, this was just a joy to print because Baumann, it's as if he had it all laid out. So all the blocks are exactly the same size, the background and the image blocks. And so you could print the background, take that block out and drop the image block in, and it's in nearly perfect register. You only had to, you know, fudge it by, you know, a fraction of an inch. Next. Yeah. So again, I guess like Baumann, as we put a book together, there's a lot of cutting and pasting and rearranging things. And it's just great to see it come to life. So you might ask, where is it now? I'm happy to say that the book is all printed and it is sitting in Truth or Consequences in various stages of being assembled by Priscilla Spitler, who has been well, she's been a saint herself in putting this book together. Not only this book, but other Palace Press books in the past. So I don't know if Priscilla is tuned in right now or not, but maybe if she is, she can chat a little bit later. But we expect to have the book back in less than 2 weeks. So I can't wait to see it. And, you know, even though one is totally familiar with all the parts, until you see the final book, you just really don't know what it looks like. But Priscilla has assured me that it's a lovely book. So, and I wanted to close with this image, which actually opens and closes the book. And this was one of those Baumann mysteries, and there are so many. But among the blocks that we took in were two different blocks that one block had the border, the dotted border, and the sort of drapery curtains across the top, and the second block had the hanging curtains. And when I proofed them, they really didn't fit together. So I had to do a little bit of Gustave Baumann cutting and pasting and Scotch taping, and we came up with this image. And it just, you know, I found it compelling. I just wasn't really sure what it was. And so it was quite a surprise when I looked at the altarpiece at Chimayo, and this panel is right central, in fact, behind a crucifix there at Chimayo. And it was really great because when I showed it to Carmella without even saying what it is, I just asked her, what do you think of this? And she identified it immediately as being that panel at Chimayo. The significance, though, beyond that story, the reason I find this so interesting is that in researching the book, we found out that it was Baumann who found out that the Santuario was about to be sold off. And he contacted Frank Applegate, who contacted Mary Austin, who was lecturing at Yale. And she contacted a friend in New York, and they came up with the money to purchase the Santuario and save it. And it was turned over to the Archdiocese by the newly formed Spanish Colonial Art Society. So I think that's a great story. And it points out that Baumann really was involved in this. And, when all the research that I was doing, you won't find Baumann's name mentioned anywhere in the books and the scholarship on this material. But he was, as he was at so many other instances, behind the scenes. He was a behind the scenes kind of guy. And he was much more important than anybody ever really realized.
Well, beyond the collection, it seems like there was a lot of research and planning that went into this. And you said you had found that story for this in doing the research. What kind of research was going into this? Because in reading Carmella's essay, I found a lot of things I had no idea about.
Well, but part of it, the Santuario story was actually not something that we discovered. That's something that's known. That was detailed in the book. One of the early books the Spanish Colonial Art Society published. And Marta Weigel and Donna Pierce's book, Spanish New Mexico, talks about that relationship. Again, for my part, in terms of the research, I always want to start with the story. So my research didn't start with diving into museum collections. It started with reading about the key players and the relationships there. And so there were three key players, of course, Baumann. And I really want to emphasize that pre-Mary Austin, there was Peggy Pond Church. She was the original collaborator with Baumann. And so I read about Peggy Pond Church, a wonderful biography written by a woman named Sharon Snyder of Los Alamos, who shed a whole wonderful light on their relationship and gave me more knowledge about Peggy Pond Church and also talked about the poetry that she was writing for this book. She wrote a suite of 7 poems. And again, in relation to even the Santuario, one of her poems that she wrote is called A Miracle Santuario. And it really tells a story that again is relating, I think, to what was going on in contemporary society in northern New Mexico at that time. There's a historical church that means so much in the lives of the people here that was going to be sold off. And if you read her poem, it alludes to that instance. And so I'm kind of guessing that maybe she wrote that knowing what was happening with the Santuario. Same thing, Mary Austin wrote about all of these things going on in her autobiographies. Gus Baumann recorded it in the buggy ride and also in his writings. So there was so much rich material there. Then the other part of it was diving into museum collections and really literally just pouring through books of some of the best known collections of Santos in Santa Fe, History Museum, SCAS, Spanish Colonial Art Society, Taylor Museum, and otherwise, and literally trying to see if we found matches for these pieces. And in many cases we did. And then in other cases, there are these absolutely wonderful Santos that we have no idea where they are. And my assumption is that many of them are lost to time. Or perhaps this book is going to actually, somebody's going to see it and go, wow, I have this in my collection and, somewhere back east or in Europe or whatever. And it would be really wonderful if we could locate some of those pieces. If they're lost, then, Baumann did us an even greater service by documenting them. So we know that there was so much more here than we might have now documented in museum collections.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
Well, I was just going to say, for my part, some of the research I was doing was in recently published Baumann material, certainly the new catalog raisonné that Gayla Chamberlain worked 30 years on. And it is just, it is the Baumann Bible. And between that and checking the chronologies in some of Marty Krause's books, and going back and forth and trying to figure out who was doing what, when. And that's when some of the pieces started falling together. One thing that I found, I was actually trying to track the blocks for a different print, actually the Eagle Dance at Tasuke that you have in your show. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to figure out where the blocks for that were. And one thing led me to the library at Princeton University. And we didn't find the block there, but I turned up some correspondence. And it turns out that was the Elmer Adler correspondence, where they wrote back and forth to each other for a couple of months talking about this book. But I think that was really a major piece of the puzzle, because you could see where the project was getting started. I guess I should just say that one of those blocks for Eagle Ceremony turned out to have been in another collection, the whole entire Baumann archive that we just took into the museum in the last month. I was thrilled to find the block in that collection. So sometime we should show it with your print.
Love it. Yeah, that's great. I actually had the privilege of going in and watching you do some of the printing, and just absolutely mind-blowing. I had a little video I put up on social media if anyone wanted to see it, but I really enjoyed seeing those blocks in person. It added quite a dimension to what I had been looking at for so long. And before I forget, we can do some Q&A if people want to enter their questions into the little chat box or the Q&A box. We can come back to questions in just a minute. Carmella, I did have another question. In reading your essay, I thought you touched nicely on the idea of appropriation and questions around that, and what Mary Austin and Baumann's and the whoever's of the world were doing and how they were dealing with that. And can you speak a little on that?
Yeah, I think Tom mentioned that some scholars didn't want to touch this because it was purely from an art historical perspective. You see the inaccuracies and you see the problems. I wanted to be able to discuss the problems because I think that we're in an age right now where these problems are in our faces all the time. Cultural appropriation is a very common phrase now. Everybody knows what it is. So I wanted to know what they were doing at that time, what that tells us today, and how that informs us. And it really highlighted for me that the things that were going on in the early 20th century when new residents were moving in and honoring and dishonoring local cultures. You can't argue that there was a little of both going on. They were setting a stage for today, and but you have to look at it through the lens of their times, and see how that lens reflects on our time. So the issues that were being created in that time of cultural appropriation, of somebody from outside of a culture coming in and interpreting material that they may not be familiar with spiritually or culturally, is that problematic? I guess you could argue, yes, it is problematic. And there are things there are approaches, particularly that Mary Austin took, that I would say are questionable today in terms of her collecting, but she wasn't the only one. But still, as I mentioned earlier, the contributions that were made are also really important. And so I think it brings up the topic of, what is it like to make art in a multicultural community, and what are the important things that you need to be considerate of, because we are a multicultural community. And I think that we could learn from the mistakes, and we could also learn from the contributions here to be really reflecting our times in a way that is appropriate, and also gives a nod to the history, whether you agree with it or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that from what I was reading, Baumann had a little bit more of a sensitivity to this, where he sort of approached this in a way where he thought there was a danger in, kind of decontextualizing these saints and taking them out of their meaning that they hold here. And
he commented very directly on some of Austin's collecting practices. The piece that was purchased in Abiquiu, he said, "I don't think that pieces like this should have sales value." He was not a collector of santos. He did collect other things. He collected from outside of his culture, but he did hold a certain reverence for santos that and their spiritual meaning. And even if you see his interpretations, he didn't go too far afield. I mean, I was talking to some people about this book, and they thought they were going to be these, multicolored, really beautiful, what you expect from Baumann. And there's a simplicity here that I think is really an honoring of the tradition in the best way. He was really looking at the way that these pieces were rendered by the santeros, and adding his twist, but also respecting the artistry of their time. And Tom, you might want to add to that.
Well, I think Gus himself said it best. And if I may, I'd like to read from his own preface to the book, just this little passage. He says, Santa Fe would not be Santa Fe without St. Francis of Assisi, the fires at Christmas and St. John's Day, and its processions, its host of little saints. We shall always have St. Francis, the fires and the processions, but the little wooden saints are leaving us for places where people are so busy they have not the time to see, listen, or believe. To present all these saints and their many variations would take us beyond the limits of time and medium. Many of them have found their way to museums and are no longer available. Others, of Spanish or Old Mexican origin, have more to do with the church than with the simplicity of home, for which most of the saints on these pages were intended. So I think that does talk to his sensitivity.
Yeah, I had written that down, the simplicity of home and how he was kind of approaching them.
Yeah.
One other point, Jonna, just about the appropriation. I think really, this whole project and speaks to the cross-cultural influence and power of the Santos. And I think it's a really positive thing. And, how people, came here and from somewhere else and did not participate in Catholicism or have much knowledge of Hispanic culture. But there was a power there that in those images that is appealing for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I just have to say that I really appreciated the way that you kind of took that head on, and it's so easy for us all to dance around these things, and you didn't really give it time to be a question. So I just want to put that out there. I really did like that. So Tom, particularly at this moment, what happens next for these prints, these blocks that you found, this material for both of you? A lot has gone into this book, and I'm hoping it all doesn't just stop here.
Well, there's so much more research to do around this stuff, but I think they offer themselves to exhibit possibilities or telling this story in an expanded, I'll just call it a trade edition, where we can actually reproduce the drawings, show photographs of the blocks, do it in an updated version. I think it would be a great contribution. I mean, you could put this in the context of other Baumann books. I mean, that's what I think a lot of people don't realize, that Baumann was thoroughly trained and skilled in making books. He knew how to do it, and some of them were small, that he published himself. But when you look at I'm just off the top of my head, I'd say 5 or 6 book projects that he did. They're, pretty amazing.
But yeah, I hope you do make another volume. I think this has all been such great information. To this beautiful book you're making now is wonderful. And it's going to be a great contribution, but I would hate to see that information not make it to the masses, everything that you have brought to this. So we have a question here. It's about your process, Tom, as far as inks and papers and material. How does that correspond to what Baumann was using?
Well, let's go with paper. I always like to talk about paper. I'll start with that. And Baumann, I always say that a Baumann print is a conversation with paper. So he always used the color of the paper, and for whatever reason, he favored a tan colored paper. So he had his own papers made. In fact, so of course I couldn't find the paper that he used, but I found a paper. It turned out to also be a German paper that is, I think Gus would have loved it. It's called Nidegen. It's, as I said, it's made in Germany. It's the right color, and so that's what we chose for the book. I will say that I'm a paper snob, so sometimes it takes a long time to find the right paper, but I was really happy to find this, and I think it works perfectly with his prints. As far as the ink, we had his proof, so I know what colors he was talking about. So I mixed up enough ink to run the job. I'm using commercial printing inks. Now, Baumann is noted for, in his prints, making his own ink, but in something like a book, he had to have enough of it and enough to print the whole series of hundreds of pages. I mean, the printing process, my colleague James Borland and I stood at the press and crank that thing. I should have showed you the slide I have of the stacks of paper before we printed them, because there was a lot of paper there, and running the press through this way, 10,000 times, that's just a guess, and probably conservative. It's about 2 months. I think we were working on it for about 2 months.
Well, I wouldn't doubt that. It looked like it was going very quickly when I was there, but I imagine that was
it's
a
one sheet at a time. Yeah, well, as it is, I just finished printing the label for the spine today. So, that's the last element.
So speaking of that, where I think you mentioned that this is going to be available in a few weeks, but where and how do people get a hold of this?
Well, we'll be selling it through the Museum of Foundation shops. There will be it'll be online, and you can purchase it online through the museum shop. And I'm sure they'll advertise it when it's available, because I think there's a lot of interest already.
I would be surprised if there weren't. It's going to be just a really amazing project. Yeah,
it is a limited edition. We printed 108 copies. If I printed 109, my arm would have fallen off. So.
Well, I don't think we have any other questions. Is there anything, I know we talked a little bit about this, but is there anything in particular that surprised you during this project? Anything else to add on that? I guess we kind of maybe touched on that.
For my part, I guess I was a little surprised that Baumann, because I don't know as much about Baumann as Tom does, or you do through your research, that he was so invested in this project. And that I always loved Baumann, but this made me love him even more, because it really spoke to a part of New Mexico that is so unique then and now. And to know that he had his heart in this was really powerful for me, and it made it even more important for me to try to give him the gift of this, seeing this project through finally. And also, Mary Austin and Peggy Pond Church. I mean, none of these people saw this project realized, and it's taken 90 years. And so all of those things surprised me and really honored me. And also, I just will say again, working with Tom is on his last Palace Press book was the greatest honor for me in my life to do this limited edition, handmade, really slow art book, which is so unusual these days. I loved it.
Tom, you sure know how to leave a room.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Carmella, that surprised me, so I'm going to leave it there.
All right. Well, I think that is all of our questions for tonight. I have many more, but I'm not going to make us all sit here while I indulge myself. So thank you both so much for this. I really enjoyed it. This project is absolutely amazing. I hope everyone gets a chance to see it and read the writings and see the beautiful work in there. And as I said, I hope there's more to come from all this wonderful material. So thank you.
Thank you, Donna.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night.